Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll go ahead and get started. People are still coming in, and we expect a lot of these seats to be filled, but I think we have a lot to discuss and some very bright people to discuss it, so let's get going. My name is Richard Bush. I'm the director of the Center for East Asia Studies here at Brookings, and it's my privilege to welcome you all today, and privilege to welcome our distinguished visitors from Japan, three of Japan's leading scholars on China. The intellectual background for this event is a recognition that probably the biggest challenge facing the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is a big asset for each of our countries, is the revival of China as a great power and how we manage it. This is something that is happening, will happen. One need not predict that this is going to end badly, but we know from history that it can end badly. So the United States and Japan separately and together have a big job ahead in trying to manage and shape this revival of China. And it seemed to me, at least, that if this is a key task of the alliance, we should start with a shared understanding of what China is and what it's about. If we have very different perspectives, which wouldn't be surprising because we're in different situations, if only by virtue of geography. But the more we can bring our understandings of China into some convergence, I think the better it is for our alliance and addressing these tasks. So back in December, we had a program on assessment of Chinese politics and the Chinese economy. Today, the focus is on security issues and foreign policy. We are fortunate, as I said, to have three of Japan's leading scholars of China, and I'm very grateful for them to come so far into this strange weather that we're having. I'm particularly grateful to Professor Akio Takahara of the University of Tokyo, with whom I've worked on this project, and I think it's been very successful. So to get us going, I would like to invite my friend Yukio Tatsumi from the Stimson Center, who will be the chair of the first panel, and ask her to introduce her colleagues and the panel itself. Yuki?
Thanks, Richard. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yuki Tatsumi, as he introduced. I'm a senior associate at the Stimson Center, which is a couple of down the block from Brookings Institution. First of all, I'd like to thank Richard and the Brookings for giving me this great opportunity to moderate this interesting panel this morning. This panel focuses on security issues, and each panelist was asked to respond to 4 broad questions, and those are the following. One, what are the key elements of Chinese security and defense strategy? Second, how would you characterize China's security policy over the last 5 years? And third, how do you assess the character and trajectory of Chinese military modernization, both over the last 15 years and into the future? And lastly, they're asked to respond to this question of how do you assess the mix of various factors that shapes the Chinese security policy. So you will hear the responses, if you will, to this broader question from three of my very esteemed colleagues that we have here today. You will have a detailed bio of each one of them, so I don't go into the details, but just going through very quickly. This morning, we first will hear from Mr. Masafumi Ida, who's a senior research fellow at the National Institute of Defense Studies, followed by Dr. David Finkelstein, a vice president and the director of the China Studies at the CNA Corporation. And to finish us off is Dr. Michael Hanlon, whose title with the Brookings is really long, but he's a co-director of Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, and also he's a director of research at the Brookings Foreign Policy Program. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Ida to the podium.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Tatsumi-san. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the Brookings Institution for giving me this very great opportunity to share my views on China's defense and security policies with distinguished scholars and practitioners here in Washington, D.C. I think it's quite natural that Japan and the United States has different views on Chinese security policies because the both countries have different level of military powers and different geographical conditions. But I think it is very important for the both of the countries to exchange perspectives on the military rise of China and its impacts on East Asian security, because deeper understanding of each other's security concerns is crucial for Japan and the United States to define common strategic goals and to strengthen the alliance, which is a cornerstone of the regional stability. So today, I will talk a little bit about Japanese perspectives on China's defense and security policies through answering questions given by Dr. Richard Bush before this seminar. I think my view on China stands in the mainstream of scholars and practitioners of security affairs in Japan, but what I will talk here is purely my own understanding and does not necessarily represent the official position of the Japanese government and the National Institute for Defense Studies. Anyway, so the first question is what are key elements of China's defense and security strategy? In recent years, China puts more and more emphasis on the need to protect core national interests. This concept of core national interests is still unclear, but I understand it includes two significantly important interests. The first one is achieving territorial integrity. And the second one is sustaining economic development. Through protecting these core interests, the Chinese Communist Party seeks to maintain its dominant position in Chinese politics. Following the core national interests, China's defense and security strategy has two concrete goals. The first one is to regain lost territories, including Taiwan, Spratly Islands, and Senkaku Islands. And the second one is to protect maritime rights and interests, such as development of oil and gas, and the safety of China's sea lines of communication. To achieve these goals, China's security strategy takes two measures: accelerating military build-up and modernization, and strengthening power projection capabilities. So what are the nature of PLA's modernization? In my understanding, the PLA aims at increasing at least 5 categories of capability. The PLA seeks to strengthen deterrence by developing and deploying sophisticated ICBM and SLBM at a strategic level, and the IR and the SLBM and cruise missiles at the regional level. Increasing sea and air control capability is an important element of PLA's modernization efforts. The PLA is gradually developing amphibious capabilities by acquiring faster and larger vessels and conducting landing exercises in the South China Sea very frequently. The PLA puts significant efforts in developing A2AD capabilities against US forces. And the PLA Navy is also seeking to increase fast sea operation capabilities by accumulating experiences in anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. Does this security strategy fit with China's grand strategy? In my understanding, China's strategic goal is to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which Xi Jinping symbolizes as a Chinese dream. From the Chinese Communist Party's point of view, the Chinese dream means strong and prosperous China under its political control, political rule. In Chinese historical sense, great rejuvenation of Chinese nation naturally means that China should re-establish its traditional paramount status in Asia. To achieve this objective, China needs to dominate at least East Asia, both strategically and economically. If my understanding of China's grand strategy is correct, China's security strategy plays an indispensable role in pursuing China's grand strategy. Are there serious contradictions between China's security strategy and foreign strategy? China's security strategy inevitably causes frictions with neighboring countries because of its coercive nature. On the other hand, Chinese foreign strategy put more emphasis on maintaining stable environment, which is conducive to Chinese economic development. There exist different aspects between Chinese security and foreign strategies. But it seems to me that the relation between security and foreign strategies is more complementary rather than contradictory. Under the Chinese grand strategy, even foreign strategy has an objective to strengthen its influence in Asia. So-called neighboring diplomacy, which the Xi Jinping administration has recently accelerated, shows a clear intention to shape Asia in China's favor. China's security strategy, seeking strong military, can support foreign strategy seeking expansion of China's sphere of influence in Asia. What is the recent nature of China's security policies? I would say China's security policy is getting increasingly assertive and aggressive, especially in the East China Sea and South China Sea. China is making use of patrol boats of China Coast Guard rather than the planned warship to show its muscles and increased presence in these waters. Chinese White House started regular patrol in the South China Sea in 2009. Chinese governmental ship for the first time intruded Japanese water around the Senkaku Islands in 2008. And the number of times of intrusion has dramatically increased since 2012. Chinese patrol boats do not hesitate to physically obstruct safety navigation of foreign vessels and fishing boats in South China Sea. I think this growing China's civilian presence in the South China Sea resulted in expansion of China's control over shoals and islets in this water. China successfully took over control of Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. In the next year, China started to obstruct the Philippines' operation for supplying to soldiers who stationed in the second Thomas Shoal. China has been conducting large-scale land reclamation of shoals in the South China Sea for making artificial islands to cement its presence in this water. At the same time, the PLA is also active in the East and the South China Sea, and occasionally takes provocative behaviors against the United States and Japan. A planned frigate directed the fire control radar to a Japanese destroyer and a helicopter in the East China Sea in 2013. A planned landing ship obstructed a safety navigation of USS Cowpens in the South China Sea in the same year. Recently, Chinese jet fighters conducted dangerously close interceptions against the surveillance aircraft of the US Navy and Japanese self-defense forces. These provocative actions by the PLA might cause fatal accidents and raise a risk of military confrontation. It seems to me that China is not serious about avoiding or reducing the risk of confrontation with regional countries, rather tends to take the risk for changing the status quo in East Asia. China's security policy aims at making changes in the existing distribution of territories and maritime rights and interests by utilizing its growing muscle. I think China's inclination for taking higher risk shows a sign of adventurism. So how is a trajectory of the modernization of Chinese military? I think China will continue its efforts in modernizing the PLA as long as Chinese Communist Party sticks to their grand strategy, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. From the Chinese perspectives, strong military is an essential measure to achieve China's strategic goals. Or maybe building a formidable PLA is one of China's strategic goals. China can afford to continue modernization of the PLA for the foreseeable future. Even though the Chinese economic growth is expected to slow down to around 5% annual growth rate, this new normal economy still can provide a large amount of defense budget for proceeding modernization of the PLA. However, the PLA still faces a lot of problems in its modernization process. First of all, the military capabilities of the PLA still lags far behind that of the United States. It will take a long time for the PLA to deter US operations in Asia Pacific. The PLA remains dominated by the Army. Even though the PLA puts emphasis on the need of joint operations, their jointness remains at low level compared to that of other developed militaries like US forces. The PLA has not engaged in real war fighting since 1988, when the plan attacked the Vietnamese Navy in the South China Sea. It is widely recognized that the PLA's anti-submarine warfare capabilities are quite weak compared to those of the US forces and the Maritime Self-Defense Force. Finally, China heavily depends on foreign military technologies such as jet engines and avionics. But I think the PLA will make every effort in tackling with these problems in this future. I think time is up. I should stop here now. So I'd be very happy to have your comments and questions later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Iida-san. I think there will be many areas where we have common views. So let's see. So thanks, Richard, for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to start my remarks by saying that I think it's a remarkable and important time to be watching the evolution of Chinese defense and security policy. We are, I believe, in an important historical interregnum during which Beijing is rethinking the PRC's role as an international security actor, reconsidering what constitutes China's national security interests, revisiting how China should pursue those interests, and re-examining how the regime should organize itself to manage security affairs. So first, where does security fit into the broader strategy? And for this current regime, security, both internal and external, you cannot separate the two, is at the top, it would appear, of the policy agenda, seemingly co-equal with development, economic modernization. In the world of CCP sloganeering, the party's message is that development and security are the so-called two major tasks that the party must pursue in tandem, with Xi Jinping himself stating that security is the foundation for development and development is the precondition for security. So security is way up there. The days of the four modernizations and defense and security at the bottom, no longer the case. So why? Why this emphasis on security and defense issues? And I think that since the 18th Party Congress in 2012, Chinese national security thinking has been driven by four factors, or three factors, frankly. First is concerns about the systemic capacity of the Chinese party state to manage, coordinate, and execute national security policy and national defense policy. Xi Jinping inherited a national security apparatus aptly described as stovepiped, turf-conscious, and horizontally uncommunicative. Moreover, it has long been clear to them that their national security interests have expanded faster than their capacity to manage them. So there's a systemic driver to their concerns about national security. Second driver, mounting concerns about domestic security, social tensions, instances of domestic violence, domestic terrorism, and other manifestations of social instability and unrest. On this account, Xi Jinping inherited over 30 years' worth of social dislocations attendant to breakneck speed economic modernization. He inherited the fruits of poor local governance and corruption, and the questionable approaches toward ethnic and religious minorities. In short, domestic security concerns relate to the political security of the party, which, as we all know, is the paramount security concern of this and any CCP-led regime. So internal security concerns are driving their thinking. Third, of course, is external security, especially as regards China's peripheral security environment. And here, of course, the 18th Central Committee leadership inherited, and in some cases exacerbated, disputes with multiple neighbors over maritime sovereignty. They inherited a U.S. rebalance, which has a significant military component. They inherited an administration in Tokyo, which, like China, seems to be rethinking its role as a security actor. They inherited a perennially truculent DPRK, which becomes a trouble magnet for their security planning. And they have concerns about terrorism and instability in South and Southwest Asia. These are just a few of the external security concerns that they're focused on. And quite important to Beijing, of course, China's external security concerns are now increasingly encompassing, and Iida-san referenced these, the physical security of Chinese citizens and economic assets based overseas, as well as access to raw materials from abroad and the maritime sea lanes that transport them to China. All of this coming under what the Chinese friends call their developmental security interests. So China now has an external abroad security dimension to what concerns them. So the party leadership is very clear in expressing its view that domestic and external security are inextricably linked. They're two sides of the same coin, with Xi Jinping therefore calling for, quote, a comprehensive approach to national security, right, that attaches equal importance to internal and external security. And it's also clear that the leadership of the party is feeling very pressed on both security fronts. Again, let me just take Xi Jinping's own words. Currently, he has said, we are challenged by pressure from two sources. Internationally, we must safeguard state sovereignty, national security, and our developmental interests. Domestically, we need to maintain political and social stability, unquote. Again, underscoring what Iida-san had to say. And of course, parenthetically, these were the words that Xi Jinping was said to have used to justify the creation in November 2013 of their new National Security Commission that is intended to better coordinate. So, given this context that I've just laid out, what would I offer as the key elements of China's national security strategy? Of course, we acknowledge at this point that on the 23rd of January, the Politburo, for the first time, they're claiming in their history, issued a national security strategy document known as the National Security Strategic Guidelines. So presumably this outline, or in Chinese, Gangyao, is there to answer all of the questions that Richard asked us to address, but it's not in the public domain, not surprisingly. So we have to speculate. So if you asked me what I would write as the preamble of this document notionally, I would give China 5 national security objectives. I won't talk about the means, but I'll talk about the ends and the ways. So first, secure and maintain the CCP's leading role at home by reforming the party itself, ensuring continued economic development, addressing social ills, suppressing dissent, and controlling the flow of information. Second national security objective I would infer to them: enhance the capacity of the party state to manage, coordinate, and execute national security policy by reorganizing or creating new, more effective organs and re-centralizing power at the center. The third I would give them would be this: defend Chinese sovereignty by employing and coordinating all the elements of national power. Fourth, create a positive peripheral security environment that will be conducive to Chinese continued development by, again, employing all the elements of national power. And on the military side, right, using almost their words verbatim, it would read like this: accelerate military modernization in order to build a PLA that can do 4 things. First, defend Chinese sovereignty close to home. Second, secure China's developmental interests abroad. Third, create a PLA that, to use their words directly, can actually fight and win battles, be combat ready. Fourth, have a PLA that reflects China's growing status as an international power of consequence. And fifth, of course, be a better joint warfighting organization. So, and again, most of that verbiage is not mine. That's what you can take from the Chinese themselves. Now, clearly, there is a terrific tension amongst some of these objectives, right? As we've pointed out already, Beijing's desire to defend its sovereignty and its desire to create a positive peripheral environment and good relations with its neighbors are sort of in a significant state of tension, right? So how they're going about dealing with their sovereignty issues is undermining their objective of positive peripheral environment. Secondly, Beijing's objective of a positive peripheral environment will also be undermined if its military modernization programs are not accompanied by effective reassurance and a higher degree of transparency than they have exhibited to date. So, turning now to the question of how to characterize this external security policy in Asia, you've already gotten the adjectives from Iida-san: proactive, assertive, persistent, calculated, and in some cases aggressive have been applied by many people. But here's how I would couch it in a larger sense. I think Beijing is proactively attempting to shape the larger security environment in Asia to serve its national interests. And in so doing, it is using multiple elements of national power: economic, diplomatic, military, informational, and cultural. Whether calling for a new regional security system, as Xi Jinping did in 2014 at the CICA conference, or in its activities in the South China Sea to include land reclamation and island building, Beijing, for the first time in a very long time, has a range of policy options at its disposal as it attempts to secure its interests. Alternately stated, Beijing is increasingly demonstrating the political will and, in some cases, the capacity to act on its security interests in the region, and we should assume that Beijing will continue to do so, causing policy dilemmas for some countries in the region. We were also asked to address the People's Liberation Army, as you've seen. What do we think about its modernization over the past 15 years and where is it going? To answer that question, I decided to lay out some significant transitions that the PLA has gone through to give you a sense of where they were before and where they are now. So first transition that I think is important. The PLA has been transitioning from its traditional role as nearly and exclusively homeland defense force to a military that is taking on new missions as an incipient expeditionary force. So the issuance in 2004 of the PLA's new historic missions of the new period in the new century was an important benchmark along this path. It's what provided the political justification to have a PLA Navy presence in the Gulf of Aden in anti-piracy operations since 2008. So that's a big transition from homeland defense to incipient expeditionary missions. Second transition, the PLA has transitioned from a force whose warfighting focus was historically centered on ground campaigns to a force that is now emphasizing the need to be able to conduct joint operations in the maritime and aerospace domains, as well as the high-tech domains that associate with them, such as cyber, outer space, and the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So this has resulted in the rising strategic and operational importance of the PLA Navy, which traditionally had not been all that operationally important, but now is. And this major transition, I think, is a function, this expeditionary element, this maritime aerospace element and transition is a function of three factors. First, of course, the globalization of China's economy. Second, the need to be able to protect presence and project presence in support of China's big power status. But most important, an assessment on the part of the PLA that China's most pressing military threats are now maritime in nature. Having spent multiple decades worrying about land invasions from the Soviets and others, that is no longer what concerns PLA planners. They're very explicit in their writings and in their articles about the nature of the maritime threat. Third transition, the PLA is transitioning to a force that increasingly has the platforms, weapons, technologies, and doctrines to extend China's operational depth beyond its borders and especially offshore. And that's significant. And this, of course, is where the U.S. and China come to loggerheads. U.S. Navy and Air Force operating forward, and the Chinese also operating forward for the first time off their littoral. Fourth transition, while still an extremely insular institution relative to other CCP organizations, and certainly much more insular compared to other foreign militaries, nevertheless, the PLA is slowly but surely engaging outside the walls of its own compounds, and it is doing so more and more as a bureaucratic actor within the party-state system, and certainly engaging more with foreign militaries, increasingly in combined activities. So overall, as a result of focused and funded modernization efforts over the last 2 decades, Xi Jinping has inherited a PLA that can provide him more operational options across a wider set of contingencies than at any time in the history of the PLA or the PRC. Now, as Iida-san has said, this is not to say that the PLA is awash in operational perfection, because it is not. The PLA is a force that has a lot of significant problems to work through and a long way to go before it meets its own aspirations. Frankly, you could have a conference on one day of everything the PLA can do and a conference the next day on everything that the PLA still cannot do. Yet, that's a relative sort of discussion. The fact is that the PLA has already become one of the militaries of importance and consequence operating in the Asia-Pacific where before there was none. And that creates all sorts of military, political, and strategic dilemmas for countries in the region, and I include in that the United States. So how about the future trajectory of the PLA? Well, that's being decided right now in Beijing. Frankly, I was surprised and more specifically very disappointed that the foreign media was near silent on the significant military reform component that came out of the decision, the formal Ding decision of the third plenum in November 2013. Like other key segments of the Chinese party-state, the third plenum laid out for the PLA a roadmap for future reform, and they were pretty transparent about what it is they intend to do. So consequently, the PLA today is 15 months into a new and I think significant period of re-energized military modernization and reform. And it's very clear that the objective of this is to enhance and improve its capacity to operate jointly in the maritime aerospace domain. So watch this space. You heard it here first. In the next couple to 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're going to see significant changes in joint command and control arrangements at the theater and national level. You're going to see significant changes to organization and force structure. You're going to see adjustments to how human capital is managed in the PLA, and you're going to see attempts to revivify the defense industrial sector through Junmin Runghe, the civil-military integration, trying to get synergies between the military and defense industrial system and the private capitalists on the private economy. So I think we're going to look back years from now at the third plenum in 2013 as the PLA's Goldwater-Nichols moment. Just as it took an act of Congress in 1986 to force the U.S. military to become the joint organization that it is today, albeit kicking and screaming, I think we're going to see that it is taking the personal political power of Xi Jinping and the imprimatur of the Central Committee back in November 2013 to force the PLA to do that which it has long known it must do to become a better force, but which has been too difficult for them to do politically without outside political catalyzing forces. So, last issues, and then I'll get off here, Yuki. We were actually asked to address if China had the intent and capacity to hold the Senkaku Islands. And I was confused and befuddled by this question, Richard, and I still am, because I do not understand why anybody would think that seizing and holding the islands is a sound operational objective in an age when standoff munitions could make these landforms nothing but a massive maritime target range. A better question might have been, could the PLA or any other force deny or control these islands from afar? And we can talk about that later if you like. They also asked us to address the question of, to what extent does the PLA pose a threat to the home islands of Japan? I scratched my head about that one also, frankly, because the PLA has had the capacity to reach out and touch Japan for a long, long time. I don't see this as a military question. I see this as a political question. And finally, the last issue about bureaucratic actors who shape Chinese foreign policy. I punt on this one by referring everybody to Richard Bush's excellent book, The Perils of Proximity, China and Japan Security Relations. Frankly, Richard has laid out very well already all of the processes and bureaucratic actors, both in Tokyo and Beijing, that he believes, and I think he's very close to the mark, how national security policy is made. But of course, we're wondering whether we need to adjust our models and paradigms because of the creation of this National Security Commission and the aspirations of Xi Jinping to be better at coordinating and controlling foreign policy. So I think this is a work in progress that we'll have to monitor as we go along. So that's all I've got in my short few minutes. Thanks for your attention, and thanks again for the opportunity to participate today.
Good morning, everyone. I guess in some sense I'm the cleanup hitter, but everyone before me already hit a home run, so there's nothing much left to do. These were excellent presentations, and I think the big issues are on the table, and I don't disagree with much of what I've heard. So let me just aggregate into a couple of broad thematic areas where I'd like to get a couple of additional points on the table or emphasize maybe some of what we've already been discussing, and then we'll look forward to the conversation amongst ourselves and with all of you in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to simplify and consolidate categories into two, sort of juxtaposing what's already out there. One will be some broad strategic aims of China, and then the second, some specific military modernization trends. On the broad strategic aims, and again, I'm certainly not an expert compared to my co-panelists or many of you, but as Jim Steinberg and I worked through our book on U.S.-China relations in the last couple of years, one thing we were profoundly struck by, of course, was the degree to which China sees itself as having come out of several centuries of relative passivity and then one specific century of humiliation. And I think it's worth remembering this because it sets the context. And at a broad, big picture level, we can't forget it, even if the century of humiliation might have technically been, depending on how you measure it, somewhere from around 1839 or 40 up through the end of World War II, and therefore already a long time ago. China is only now getting the means to sort of make sure it never happens again, or if you want to put it a little bit more harshly, seek some payback for certain historical grievances that it may still feel it has. And in fact, in addition to that broad theme of the century of humiliation, I would add another, and I'll put it right out there on the table. Since we're talking among US and Japanese friends, I actually believe that antipathy towards Japan is a foreign policy motivation for Chinese foreign policy. And I hope that's not true forever. I hope it's partly a function of specific dynamics in the period of the Abe administration. And by the way, when I say that, I'm not necessarily blaming Japan or Prime Minister Abe, although on the latter point I would have a couple of specific quarrels, but I'm simply observing how it looks to me in terms of what are the drivers of where China's coming from. For example, with the Senkaku Islands, this is an unimportant issue in any objective sense. And there's really nothing that can motivate it except some sense on China's part of trying to right an historical grievance. That's the way it looks to me. I'm a generalist. Many of you are specialists. You can correct me in a few minutes. But I actually think it's simple and straightforward and worth putting on the table to simply say that the animosity that China feels towards Japan is actually a motivator and almost an objective. Redress in regard to some of these grievances is part of what's informing Chinese grand strategy and foreign policy making. A couple of more things. Again, from a broad generalist point of view, I think it's worth noting that China is an incredibly powerful country now. And when countries and powers and superpowers rise, historically, they tend to assert themselves. And China, it's worth remembering, is now the world's second largest economy, even by classic measures. We had a good discussion here a couple of weeks ago. Richard was kind enough to be on a panel that I asked him to participate in with Bud Cole and David Dollar, and we were talking about China's rise and its significance for the U.S. defense budget debate. And David Dollar pointed out that, according to the IMF and purchasing power parity considerations, by some metrics, China has already reached American GDP. But you don't have to believe that to recognize that China now does have a GDP of $10 trillion a year, even by classic measures. The US is $17 trillion. China is easily the second largest economy in the world, even by classic measures. And it's easily the second largest military budget in the world by any metric that you want to invoke, even if there's still plenty of room for contention about exactly what the level is. And what this means is that China is going to be more assertive. Now, my view, watching this, again, not as a specialist, is that China hasn't quite figured out what that means. They haven't quite figured out just how assertive they want to be, what their real goals are. They say they want most of the South China Sea. They say they want the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Is that it? How serious are they about that? Of course, there's the Taiwan question. Just how big are their ambitions? Are these sort of the initial canaries in the mine that we should watch as China becomes potentially more hegemonic throughout the whole region? These are, in some sense, unanswerable questions. But I think that the specific areas where China's being more assertive are actually, in the grand historical scheme of things, relatively modest ambitions for a country of the power that China is now attaining. I'm not trying to defend China's behavior, but I'm simply saying that when you observe this in a classic realist construct, as many American and Japanese and other international relations scholars would have us do, or historians would have us do, the ambitions displayed by China so far are relatively natural for a power of this size and scale and muscle. Again, I'm not trying to condone it, but I think when you ask me or ask to discuss the question of what's motivating China, I think part of this is, to quote our friend Bob Kagan, our colleague here at Brookings, asking why China is becoming more assertive is sort of like asking why a baby tiger grows teeth when it grows up. And we don't want to lose sight too much of that natural tendency, even as we think about how we should try to influence and maybe even at times push back against some of this Chinese assertiveness. And then finally, of course, and it's been mentioned by Masafumi and by David both, but China also wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to do all of this and still get along with the rest of the world and maintain its economic rise. So there is this tension, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time, and will today spend a lot of time, trying to figure out which of these concerns is more important to China. Again, to me as a non-specialist, I think the answer is we don't know and they don't know. They're still tactically figuring out, step by step, what they can get away with in the security realm without leading to strong counter-reactions. They're probably watching with great interest what Vladimir Putin's been doing in Ukraine. I'm not suggesting the Chinese are as belligerent and as irrational and as mean-spirited as Vladimir Putin, but I am suggesting that they're probably intrigued by how much the world reacts to what Putin does, and how this almost provides a little bit of a rheostat or a barometer of just how much assertiveness and aggression it takes to get certain types of sanctions when you're a great power in the international system today. So my only view, to conclude this first section of my short presentation, is that if you ask how to ascertain China's relative priority of asserting itself, promoting its security goals and aims, getting some payback against Japan and other regional countries, but especially Japan, that it may feel it's entitled to, and you balance that against the desire to maintain stability and economic cooperation and the pursuit of prosperity, I don't think China has a particularly elaborate grand strategy buried away in some vault in Beijing. I bet they're just trying to feel it step by step. After all, let's remember that's what most countries do with most of their foreign policy most of the time, even our own. We may write grand strategy documents and national security strategies, and our good friend Susan Rice did a nice job here 3 weeks ago from this very place of explaining it. But a lot of what a great power does in a place like Syria or Iraq or Ukraine or what have you is a step-by-step incremental decision-making process. And I would simply propose that that is perhaps what China's doing as it tries to figure out just how far it can go on things like South China Sea assertiveness. Okay, so that's my amateur hour attempt to try to weigh in on the first couple of questions, especially on what are the key elements of Chinese foreign policy thinking and what's been motivating its behavior. Now let me quickly turn to the second area, where in theory I have at least slightly more expertise, although not as much as David, and that's the issue of China's military modernization and what it means and where it's headed. And again, he's done a very nice job, as has Masafumi, very nice presentations of some of the specifics going on and how to understand this. So I just want to amplify a couple of the points. And maybe what I would suggest is that, again, there is some nuance that we need to understand here. And Richard and Bud Cole and David Dollar and I were talking about this a couple of weeks ago from this stage, because on the one hand, China is now the world's second largest military power by spending. It's the number one power by the size of the military. It's certainly the number one power by the pace at which it's improving. And yet it remains very far behind the United States, arguably in some areas of technology still behind Japan, even though Japan's military budget is more modest. But both countries are actually spending a modest percentage of their gross domestic product on their armed forces, both Japan and China. And I'll just remind friends in the room that, again, we discussed this a bit with David Dollar, a very good economist, with Richard, with Bud Cole. You all know that China's military budget is somewhere plus or minus $150 billion a year. But of course, it's not really measured in dollars. And so how do we really understand the proper way to measure the resources that are going into this? It's probably $150 billion a year, plus or minus $50 billion, when you actually do all the proper conversions and estimates and so forth. But that's about 1.5% of GDP, plus or minus, let's say, a few decimal points. So 1.5% of GDP, maximum 2%, probably a little less. By contrast, my country still spends 3.5% of GDP on its armed forces. Japan, of course, is still around 1%. For all the talk of Abe's big military modernization and aggressiveness, Japan's basically still at 1.0% of GDP military spending. China is very much in the center of the world's major countries in terms of that burden. So most of our European allies are averaging about 1.4, 1.5% of their GDP devoted to their military forces. With them, we complain that it's not enough. As you'll recall, NATO countries are supposed to spend 2.0% of their GDP. That is an official NATO goal, and only about 3 of us do it. In China's case, they're spending about 1.5%, and we complain that it's too much. Now, in some ways it is, because it's not clear they're being threatened in a way that requires the kind of buildup they've been undergoing for the last couple of decades. But it's still worth placing some of these numbers in international perspective. So that would be one point I would say. Having said all of that, however, I would note that China's improvement is quite notable in a number of domains of military technology and capability. And the point I want to make here, because we've already heard such excellent remarks from David and Masafumi, is simply to add one more dimension, which is that above and beyond the increases in numbers of different things, we're also at a point in the evolution of military technology where there are a couple of the kinds of weapons China's buying that are particularly important for shifting the military balance right now. And that would be precision strike and submarines, if you asked me to start with the top two. Also, cyber and space, as David mentioned, are important. But the fact is, we all hear this talk of anti-access area denial capabilities or concepts that China might be pursuing. Sometimes that's a Western attempt to explain what we think they're doing. It may not be their words. But the point is that because precision strike is becoming so much more potent, and because we still don't have good enough missile defenses to really counter the kinds of effects that precision cruise missiles or ballistic missiles can achieve when they're launched in large numbers, the offense has the advantage in this area of military technology right now, and the offense is getting very good. And it's striking that when I first started looking at the China-Taiwan military balance in the late 1990s, and you try to think about what China could do to Taiwan's airfields, they had old-fashioned jets that we would have seen coming, the Taiwanese would have seen coming long before they arrived. They had missiles that if they tried to launch a missile from southeastern China at Taiwan, it probably would have been aimed at the airfield and it would have hit the next door cow pasture. It would have missed by a half mile. That was the typical circular error probable of a Chinese missile of that day. Today, as you know, we now think that some of the medium and short-range Chinese ballistic missiles may have circular error probables of only 20 or 30 meters, which means you can literally use them to hit runways and cut the runway in half and incapacitate the runway for some period of time. This is a major change in military technology. So it's not just that China has more money to put into it. It's the technologies themselves are proliferating and becoming more potent. And this is sort of the follow-on to what we saw in the United States first in Operation Desert Storm in the era of precision strike as it became most visible in our military forces in the early 1990s. And China has now in some ways caught up. The last point, submarines. What submarines do, what quiet submarines do for China, is give them the ability to prevent the United States from treating the Western Pacific like an American lake. And for decades we could, at least vis-a-vis the Chinese, maybe not vis-a-vis the Soviets. But now we can't, because we're not going to see these submarines or hear them, in many cases, until they would be in position to shoot at us if they wished. And this complicates all sorts of operations, including something Richard and I wrote about in a book we did 8 years ago, where we thought through the issue of a possible Chinese blockade against Taiwan or certain other neighbors. I realize we're not necessarily talking specifically about Taiwan this morning, but just to give one example of the trends in technology, the ability of China to now impose very strict limits on the safe operations of commercial or military vessels in the Western Pacific is a major change from the way things were 15 or 20 years ago. Partly a reflection of China's greater resources, but also of trends in defense technology that have allowed countries to acquire quiet and long-endurance submarines without having to spend $2 or $3 or $4 billion on a nuclear attack submarine like we do. So when I put all these trends together, in conclusion, I would simply say that the Chinese military has come a long way. And on balance, I'm more impressed by the things that it can now do that it could not before, recognizing there are still limits and that China's not embarked on all-out military buildup doesn't necessarily prove a deeply hostile intent, but it sure does give the PLA some capabilities that it never had before. And that makes our lives a lot more complicated and this discussion a lot more important, so I'm thrilled to be part of it. And I guess we'll now stay up here and gather for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Can everybody hear us? So from this point, we just heard three excellent speakers, and we're going to move to a discussion section. To start off, I'd like to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask each speaker to elaborate a couple of the points that they made in their presentation. And then I will start from bottom to the top. So I'll go in the reverse order, and then I'll start with Mike. Two quick questions. While I was listening to you in combination after Ida-san and David's presentation, I just can't help feeling that Japan and China, in a sense, are each other's mirror image when it comes to security intentions, strategic intentions, or policy trajectory, especially when it comes to military modernization era. So I just wondered, there's particular phrase that you said in your presentation that stuck in my mind, that antipathy toward Japan, in your observation as a journalist, is one of the really, frankly, dominant driver of the Chinese policy in certain areas. And when we looked at the Japan's recent diplomatic outreach to various countries such as India, Russia, Southeast Asia, how would that look to you in a sense that how much of that is a reaction that the Chinese expanding influence around the globe is driving that thought? That is one question. And the second quick question is you talked about how Chinese military budget, although in the comparison for GDP ratio, it's kind of at the average of the major powers. But you made a specific point that they're putting the money in the right place to make their force more effective, more joint. And I wonder what kind of observation that you make about the Japan's defense spending, particularly on the area of defense investment in the. And to you, Mr. Ida-san, to you, David, is you also talked about the PLA modernization, and again, also very mirror image of Japan, of what China and Japan are really looking at each other, and almost like they're feeding off of each other's of what each other is doing, and they're reacting to the change. And how would you characterize that action reaction pattern in your mind between China and Japan? And what are the things that is important moving forward for those of us in the United States to watch out, so that this action reaction feeding off of each other chain reaction is managed to the point where it doesn't get into the higher level of tension? And finally, for Ida-san, since because you didn't have much chance to talk about your last slide about the key elements moving forward, I wonder, David talked a lot about the drivers of the Chinese policy, and specifically talked about the domestic component of it. So I would also like to ask that question to you of how would you observe the Chinese domestic security situations, and how this leadership is perceiving that, and how the power base of the current leadership is in China. Some say it's very solid, and some say it's very, still very vulnerable, given all these riots and the social unrest. So I would just like to hear your views. So starting from Mike.
Thank you. A couple of quick thoughts. I'm not an expert on the drivers of Japanese foreign policy behavior, but I do think that what Prime Minister Abe is doing in the region is similar to what we're doing in the region, which is to not contain China, but to try to counter in some ways, while we're also trying to cooperate where possible. And so certainly Prime Minister Modi, take one example, one very important example, in India, is an important person for both Japan and the United States. And we look to him as a person who can hopefully do great things within India, and also, we hope, stabilize South Asia and relations with Pakistan, but to some extent also be a counterweight to China's rise. And I have no doubt that that is on Prime Minister Abe's mind as well. It doesn't have to be all unhealthy, that there's a little bit of competition and that there's a little bit of effort to counter China's influence. In fact, China works very hard to expand its influence. So I would applaud Prime Minister Abe for that kind of regional diplomacy, even as I would wish that on a couple of history questions he would be slightly more careful and sensitive. And it's worth putting that on the table today as well, I think, at least from my vantage point. Overall, by the way, I'm an optimist that long-term Japan and China, two great countries, two amazing countries, two very wise countries, will figure out a way to get along. The problem is we have to get to the long term, and it may take a little while, and there may be some danger along the way. Secondly, on the other question you asked about, I think if I understood correctly, the appropriateness and wisdom and proper allocation of Japan's defense investments these days, overall they look reasonable to me. I'll be honest, while I do wish that Prime Minister Abe would handle certain history questions a little better, I'm very pro-Japan in terms of its defense policy, and I wish it had more. I wish that Japan was spending 1.5% of its GDP on its military. But what I'd like to see Japan do with that money in this dream world that I'm imagining right now, where Japan actually added 50% to its military spending, is that it could become a more important global player in peace operations by making its forces more deployable, more usable in peace missions, that sort of thing, not simply spent on countering missiles and submarines in the Western Pacific that China may deploy against it. I think if Japan could maintain that additional focus in its defense modernization, it would send a message that it's not just trying to anticipate a zero-sum competition with China, but it's also trying to expand in a very constructive multilateral way its broader role in global affairs. And that would be my recommendation.
Well, thanks for that great question. I'm going to start by saying that I'm not convinced that Chinese military modernization per se is reacting to anything Japan per se is doing. I tend to look at Chinese military modernization as a long-term project that's been going on actually since 1949 with different periods of emphasis. But what I'd like to do is use 1993 as the starting point for where we are today. The PLA that we are looking at today that causes concerns for some is the result of focused and funded modernization priorities that began in 1993 when then Jiang Zemin, CCP General Secretary, issued a new national military strategy, the Military Strategic Guidelines for the new period. And since 1993, PLA modernization has been on a steady path of variation on a theme. And it's been driven by two things: a capabilities-based imperative and a contingency-based imperative. A capabilities-based imperative means the PLA decided that there were certain fundamental things that it had to do, that war as a general phenomenon, sui generis, had transformed to such a degree that it had to have certain capabilities. And the driver of what the PLA ought to have to fight what they call local wars under modern informatized conditions is what the U.S. has demonstrated, because the U.S. is the operational gold standard. And so it took Desert Storm in '91 to shake the PLA out of its complacency. And since that time, they've been on a steady glide path to improve the technological capacity of the PLA, to improve the human capital, to get the weapons and platforms they need to fight these major types of modern high-tech wars, to include the space systems and their anti-satellite systems, right? So that's capabilities-based. Contingency-based. The contingency-based driver is where do they think they really may have to fight a war? And for the most part, since 1993, Taiwan has been labeled in the lexicon of Chinese operational doctrine the main strategic direction. That means that most, but not all, of their warfighting contingency planning is about how they would fight a Taiwan scenario. And there's a certain beauty and simplicity in having one main strategic direction, because in the case of China, if they can field a military that can deal with a Taiwan scenario, they can field a military that can deal with all of their real scenarios, because it's all peripheral, maritime, and aerospace. So that's a long way of answering your question and saying that while the PLA may adjust this system or that system to deal with what Japan may or may not do, I don't see Japan as being the driver of what the Chinese are doing. Japan is certainly the object of why the PLA might be doing it, but not tit for tat. It has a life cycle of its own, capabilities-based, contingency-based.
Thank you, Tatsumi-san, for your questions. I think that it's very clear that the Chinese domestic situation or domestic problems which the CCP is facing is a very important driver for their decision-making of the external policies. So it is widely said that the Chinese external policy is an extension of the Chinese domestic policies. So that's why we should, if we gonna understand the Chinese external policy, we should put focus on the China's domestic policies and domestic situations. And I think from this point of view, there are two ways to understand the relationship between the Chinese domestic situation and external policies. The first understanding will be that because China has to deal with the domestic situation, especially the continue to the of the economic development. The China's external policies should be moderate to seek for cooperation with the international community. This is the one of the understanding of the relations between the external policies and the internal policies. And the second, the other understanding is that to deal with or to solve this domestic situation is really difficult. It is very difficult for the CCP to deal with this domestic situation. So under these circumstances, it is easier way for the CCP to take tough external policies toward like Japan and other smaller countries in Southeast Asia to divert the dissatisfaction among the Chinese societies toward the external enemy or the scapegoat. So this is going to be the second understanding of the relations, the domestic and the external policies. And I'm very afraid that the second option, second understanding can be an option for the CCP's leadership.
Thank you. I think before opening the floor up to the question, I thought I would just go back to ask each of you to see if you have questions to each other's presentations. So I would start off with David and then go down.
I think that I really enjoyed both the presentations. I had no major disagreements with them, but I know that we need to get our arms around this PLA modernization. What does it represent? What types of challenges is at a tactical level, operational level, strategic level? There are different ways of coming at this, and we need to have common language to think about it. So I really don't have any serious questions for any of the presenters, except to thank them for helping me to understand better their perspectives. This is great.
If you have any.
Yeah, I think all of us agree that the situation, reality that the Chinese PLA has made a very good progress in its modernization. That's our consensus. But maybe the different views on the impacts of the Chinese PLA's modernization toward the security in this region, and particularly to Japan. Now, I think that now Japan is facing a very real security concern against our sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands. So I think that so this made us very seriously think about the security concern from the rise of China. So I think that from the U.S., is much more stronger than Japan, than China, and geographically is very far from the East Asia. So I understand that the United States is more relaxed to understand the China, the security concerns which derives from the rise of China. So I think that as he said that I do not understand the current situation in East Asia is action-reaction chain. I think that the current the Chinese PLA modernization is China's unilateral decision because for example, in 1990s and early 2000s, even though the Japanese defense budget decreased, during this time, China unilaterally increased their defense budget at the double-digit rate annually. So this is the clear proof that the current the Chinese development of PLA is not the reaction against the Japanese policies. Thank you.
So can I just say that, I found it curious that you observed that the U.S. may be relaxed about PLA. I'm not sure that relaxed is a word I would use. I think there are pockets in this country that are very focused on and concerned about that. So.
Well, first of all, that's the main point I was going to make myself, so thank you. And I'll just reiterate and echo that by David. We're maybe a little more relaxed. We're not that relaxed about this issue. We may care less about the Senkaku Islands on their own terms, but we do care about the Senkaku and what that means for the broader Japan-China relationship and as an indicator of Chinese behavior more generally. The question I have, Masafumi, is about whether there's anything else that the Japan security debate is able to focus on. And the reason I ask is because if you look back 25 years, Japan was starting to get more willing to do things in peace operations, East Timor, a few other places, and of course,
Rwanda.
and then even in a complicated way in Iraq. And it feels that now we're at a point where the Japanese security debate is so consumed by China that whatever trends might have been incipient for Japan playing a more constructive international role militarily in some of these multilateral missions has been partly lost. Is that fair, or is there hope that Japan can do both these things at the same time, focus on China, but also expand its role in these multilateral missions?
Thank you. I think that the Japan was and has been very eager to make contribution to the international security. And I think Japan will continue to take this position. But very unfortunately, in recent years, Japan is facing more immediate security problems from the rise of China. So that's why now the Japanese defense policies put much focuses on how to defend the Japanese sovereignty, Japanese territories from the immediate concern from China. But still, I think the Japan will make contribution to the international securities by participating in the PKOs or other multilateral cooperation for such as the HADR and something.
Let me open up the question to the floor. If you could raise your hand and please wait until the microphone gets to you. And please say your name and identify yourself. And please make your question concise so that we can fit in as many questions as we can. We'll start from the gentleman on the right.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to ask you something about policy making. So you mentioned the Chinese NSC, and I'd like to ask you, so what kind of role is the NSC playing to make security strategy or security policy? And which is more, have more power, bigger power, CMC or the NSC to make this kind of decision? Thank you very much.
Is this question any one of the?
Yeah, especially David.
David, okay. And let me collect maybe a couple of more and then go back to you. Gentlemen, over the left.
Thank you, Nick Farmer. Two short questions. One is, do you see any threat from China's point of view, land-based threat from either India or Russia over the next 20 or 30 years that they need to address? And secondly, what should the U.S. policy be vis-a-vis the pivot to Asia in the context of the topics we've been discussing this morning?
Second, perhaps, Mr.
Yoshi Komori of the Sankei Shimbun. This is a question for Mr. Finkelstein. I think you made a remark something to the extent that the Chinese military capability to attack Japan has been there. It's nothing new. Okay. Regarding that particular aspect of the Chinese capability, in my observation, probably the most effective component of that particular capability is the intermediate and the medium-range missiles, both ballistic and cruise, that PLA has deployed, probably in totaling its number, probably 200, 300. Interestingly, nothing has been mentioned among the debates or debaters in Japan about that. And would you address that particular aspect of in the context of this China-Japan sort of a relationship?
So two questions to David specifically. So Chinese NSC and this missile, medium range and a cruise missile from China. And then I think next question was U.S. policy pivot to Asia. I think I would assume it's probably to you, Michael, and then if David has anything to add.
Okay, so I'll try to cover them briefly. So you're quite correct. The creation of the National Security Commission has raised as many questions as it has provided answers. We don't even know what the full membership is, other than the chairmanship by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and Zhang Dejiang as co-chairs. We know that in some of the speeches of Xi Jinping that have been published recently, he talks about the role of coordinating across the Chinese interagency and developing security policy. Yet, when the Politburo issued the new National Security Strategic Guidelines, their National Security Gangyao, back in January, there was no mention of any role that the National Security Commission played, although we assumed that there had to be one. So we have more questions than answers. How does the Central Military Commission play into this? What happens to the National Security Leading Small Group or the Foreign Affairs Leading Small Group, the Lingdao Shaozu? How does that, will that still exist? We don't know. Maybe others do, I certainly don't, but these issues are not in the public domain. The one thing that I'm told consistently, though, is that this Security Commission will spend, they think it's going to be 60% on internal security, 40% on external security. So this commission is handling both sides of that coin. So not very helpful answers, but I wish I could answer them, and I'd write a great paper. On missile defense, yeah, I think on missiles, yeah, of course. The Chinese have had the capability to put missiles on Japan for a long time, and I think that that's why the U.S. and Japan are coordinating on missile defense, right? And why it's a good thing that we're cooperating on missile defense, because we also have the problem of North Korean missiles. So I think that's a great thing that our alliance is doing. We also make sure that we have the right mix of U.S. naval forces in the region. So yeah, but that's nothing new, right? That's nothing new. The question is, what does Japan feel it needs to do about that particular threat, which is not new? And on China-Russia borders, yeah, China has 14 land borders, and they're pretty quiescent at the moment. And if you read what the Chinese strategists are saying in the PLA, they don't believe that they face any imminent invasion from any land neighbor at the moment and for any time to come is their language. Yet they have to remain vigilant, right? They've got to maintain forces on those borders. They fought a war with India in 1962. That they haven't resolved that border dispute. And of course, they fought with the Soviets in 1969 up on the border at Damansky Island in Heilongjiang. So while they're not expecting any land invasions, the PLA, again, predominantly a ground force, has a lot of troops that they throw at these 14 land borders.
On that question, I think I would agree with David and therefore take it one step further and turn the question around and say, does China want to have an assertive offensive capability on any of its land borders? And I don't see, again, David studies this and my good friend Masafumi knows this better than I, but I don't see any particular sinister plot right now. But I have observed that, of course, China did carry out some maneuvers on its disputed border with India, precisely the time when President Xi was visiting India, which is fairly striking. And certainly Russia, for all the other reasons why we're not getting along with them right now and we're not going to be able to do any nuclear arms control anytime soon, the Russians want their nuclear weapons against the hypothetical Chinese threat as much as anything else. And that's going to be a reason why over time it's going to be hard to do another round of deep cuts in nuclear forces. So I think that's not to say China really has ambitions on Siberia, but there are Russians who worry that it might someday. And quickly on the pivot, the nice thing about the pivot is that it's not a pivot, it's a rebalance. I'm not saying that just because I'm politically correct and I prefer the softer term, but we're not pivoting. If you look at what we are doing by way of allocating our military forces, it's a much more modest readjustment. And I think the centerpiece of the rebalance in military terms is the shift to have 60% of the U.S. Navy home ported in and around the general Asia-Pacific theater, in contrast to the historical average of 50%. Even that shift, which may amount to sort of a $10 to $15 billion a year reallocation within the annual budget, one time, even that shift overstates the change because we can use carriers based in California and go to the Persian Gulf. In other words, we don't have to just put them in the Western Pacific. So the fact they're home ported in the general theater doesn't mean they're just against China or any other particular Western Pacific concern. So to me, this is about the right degree of response militarily. It's firm, it's meaningful, but it's not overly dramatic. And so I'm quite comfortable with it.
Hong Kong, visiting fellow Central East Asia policy study. I want to ask one short question about domestic security, about Xinjiang, because I have been following the Xinjiang province, especially Southern Zhejiang. Each year, recently, there have a couple hundreds of the terrorist attacks in Xinjiang, and it's spreading out. It's not just in Xinjiang, now in Yunnan, in other places. They have some kind of tensions, religious awakening. It's not just Muslim, basically Christian brothers, but mostly security concern over focus on Muslim, and especially in Southern Zhejiang is really critical because they're now closing the information, so most people don't know, but actually there's a lot of hazards in terms of the guerrilla warfare or the sort of domestic problem. So I want to ask you to give a quick assessment about the domestic security concern.
Whoever has the next one will be the last question. If you have one, gentleman on the back, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much, Jay Taylor. I think the panel all seems to agree that China has the long-term objective and grand strategy of achieving military parity with the United States in terms of influence and military status as well. But the Chinese still seem to have many, I think the Chinese government, including Xi Jinping, seem to recognize that China also has a very fundamental continuing interest in cooperation with the United States. And they want to see this change in which China achieves parity. They want to see it achieved in a stable framework because China has many goals that it achieves through this continued dominance of the United States in the Pacific. And they want to see that change, but only gradually, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, for example. But in other places, we also see U.S.-Chinese interests in strategic matters, in important security matters continuing, as in Afghanistan, whereas the Chinese suddenly have come to realize, I think all along, they thought the United States was doing their work in Afghanistan. And now we see them becoming involved in the political process and trying to provide a future that will prevent the return of the Taliban. So I'd like the panel to comment on these continuing strong strategic interests that give some hope that there's going to be a stable transformation as China's rise.
To the lady in front.
My name is Li Yang. I appreciate this presentation, and I always wonder peace and wars and military and defense. I just wonder if you can give me some kind of perspective from the social, cultural, point of view, whether that is really some kind of first invasion or the other way is colonization or give away some territory. I just wonder, is this played by any kind of social cultural group, by maybe capitalist, rather than say, I really love my people. I really like the Taiwanese people. That's why I want you to be back to my territory. Or is it a way they say, well, capitalists is losing the war, so we want to give away this part of territory so you can have it. So I just wonder, this war and peace is really some kind of play by capitalists or some kind of imperialism. That's why they would say give away or invasion or military or defense, whatever the reason. I just don't see the point really for the general public or the war people.
So three fairly broad questions. So whoever would like to go first, I'll
take the
we'll
second question briefly, and I'll just give it's a very well-phrased question. You probably gave a better statement of the question than I can give of an answer. Let me just give one indirect answer, which is that when Jim Steinberg and I were doing our book, Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, and Jim, the reason I invoke this is because Jim is such a thoughtful student of U.S.-China relations and was Deputy Secretary of State, as you know. And the basic motivation for our book, we debated for quite a while, are we fundamentally hopeful about the U.S.-China relationship or fundamentally pessimistic? And to be honest, we never answered that question to our mutual satisfaction. We decided we didn't need to because we were both worried enough that we wanted to suggest some steps that would be helpful to reduce the risks, whatever they were. But the one thing we really couldn't agree on to settle the basic premise of the book is this trajectory of the relationship headed in a gradually more hopeful direction or not? And the bottom line is, I don't know. I think you can make a pretty strong case either way. So I'm going to plead agnostic on that, which may sound like a punt, but in reality, it's pleading, I think, that hopefully an intellectual humility, but the important point is that on policy grounds, we should not assume that we're headed in a positive direction. We better have conferences like this and address questions like this because there is still plenty of room and plenty of ways in which this relationship could go sour. The U.S.-China and the Japan-China relationships can both be, I think, very dangerous going forward.
David, and then
I'll address that question also. I think one of the very frustrating things about being in the security business, especially the U.S.-China security business, is that you're always in the bad news business, and you get a very distorted view of what the overall relationship is really about. When in fact, the U.S.-China relationship is broad and wide and defined by much more than what our two militaries are or are not doing. And by the way, if there's a consensus that the Chinese are trying to have military parity with the U.S., I'm not sure I signed up to that one. But just so I'll leave you with this. I think that, and this sort of supports what Michael's saying, is that I think that the U.S.-China relationship is going to continue to be a tangled and messy web of issues, which on one hand force us to cooperate out of selfish national interest, and we do that, right? Because sometimes our national interests do intersect, and another set of interests that are going to cause contention and tension. And the role of policymakers and our elected leaders and the public in general is to manage this relationship so that it stays in balance, so that we're able to expand the areas where cooperation serves both our national interests and manage those tensions on the security side to mitigate the problems so that we don't have to test some of the hypotheses that have been floated about what the PLA can or cannot do. And that's why we pay our elected officials the big bucks. So I'll leave you with that. So I think I see that as sort of supporting where Michael's coming from. On the question of internal security, I think you're quite right to be raising these questions. Again, although I'm in the PLA business, I'll tell you that I personally believe that when Xi Jinping wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, it's not the Senkaku/Diaoyudao that he's worried about. I think at the end of the day, this guy is worried about how he's going to keep the lid on ethnic tensions, how he's going to provide increasing numbers of jobs annually for graduating college students, close the rich-poor gap, close the east-west gap, how he's going to deal with the debilitating impact of environmental degradation that is causing the rising middle class to start voting and voicing their concerns in ways hitherto unimaginable. So, which is why I'm not surprised, going back to what I mentioned earlier, that this National Security Commission is going to be probably more, as much if not more, focused on internal issues than external issues. There's a lot of bad things that can happen in China. A lot of things can go terribly wrong. And I've also come to the conclusion in my old age that the U.S. has as many national security interests at stake if things go bad in China as we do as if China continues to rise. So we've got some real policy challenges on our hand here in the U.S. and certainly in Japan and other countries in the neighborhood. We can't allow China to fail, but we're not sure what happens if it continues to succeed.
Yeah.
Yasna has a final word.
Yeah, I think there is a very variety of common interest among China, United States, and Japan. For example, the economic development or trade and investment. And these common interests can be a foundation for better relations between Japan and China and the US and China. But very unfortunately, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party really heavily depends on the nationalism. So I think the Chinese Communist Party should make every effort to override the century of humiliation, what you mentioned before. And to override the century of humiliation, the China has to make every effort to take over the lost territories and re-establish the paramount position in Asia. So that's inevitably Chinese Communist Party cannot but help challenging the existing order. I think the Chinese Communist Party cannot be satisfied with the existing order led by the United States and other democracies in this region. So this is going to be the very, very high obstacle for the better relations between China and US and Japan.
Thought about the internal situation relating to the Xinjiang question that.
Oh yeah, actually, I don't know much about the Chinese domestic situation, but as I mentioned before, this kind of very difficult the domestic problems can be a driver for the assertive external policies.
Well, thank you all for your very thoughtful questions, but then thank you all for your very thoughtful presentation, and please join me in thanking the presenters for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you to the panel. Thanks to Yuki. We'll now have a coffee break, and let's return around 10 minutes to 11, which is 12 minutes from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Always a pleasure.